Channel Sports Central will be going over our next final prediction of this offseason, and it's going to be over the Florida State Seminoles. And this is a team that was 6-7 last season, and of course it was their final season having to be under Willie Taggart. It ended up being kind of a down season in comparison to how many expected it to be. But whether or not this team will improve on that in 2020 and why I think Florida State could be actually a good team in 2020 is what we're going over here today. We're also going to be going over returning production along with a full prediction and preview on every game on the Seminoles schedule going into the 2020 season. So with that, let's look at your season trends from 2019 for this team. Once again, they were 6-7 overall. They were 4-4 between September and October, and then 2-3 between November and the postseason. So, I mean, they did have a couple of good wins right off the bat, but this was a team that really kind of dropped off as the season went on. Of course, once again, they were 2-3 between November and the postseason. So they were pretty consistent though with how they were. There were no major improvements or declines over the season, but they did have a couple of good wins. Of course, they beat off Louisville 35-24. That was a big win there. Of course, Louisville last season was actually not that bad of a team, and I expect them next season to definitely be a contender in the ACC. They also beat off Syracuse 35-17, and they also beat off Boston College 38-31, and that was a road game at Boston College as well. So in the end, still a good season for Florida State. They were 6-7. They made it 2 bowl games. So in the end, there's really nothing to complain about there. But as far as returning production looks, of course, they returned their top quarterback in James Blackman, and he was the primary quarterback for this team last season. Of course, he split time with Alex Hornibrook. Of course, Hornibrook, he had transferred in from Wisconsin before last season, and so it was kind of uncertain as to whether or not he'd be playing a whole lot. But they ended up splitting a decent amount of time. James Blackman did end up having the better of the stats overall, as he had 2,300 yards with 17 touchdowns and 11 interceptions last season. He also had a 63% completion rate. So in the end, I would say James Blackman was the better quarterback of them two last season. And I think next season, I mean, he had a pretty terrible touchdown to interception ratio, as it was nearly a 1-to-1. Most touchdown to interception ratios are good if they've got like a 4-to-1 or a 5-to-1. For example, if you need an example, Joe Burrow last season had basically a 6-to-1 touchdown to interception ratio, and he had 60 touchdowns. But in the end, yeah, James Blackman, he definitely needs to improve that interception rate. He needs to lower that quite a bit if this team is going to be good next season. And I mean, his completion rate was pretty good, 63%. Really is not all that terrible in comparison to some quarterbacks. But of course, they did lose their second quarterback in Alex Hornibrook. Once again, he will not be returning to this team next season. He had just right around 1,000 yards with 7 touchdowns and 2 interceptions, and also had a 68% completion rate, which, of course, he had the better completion rate, but you also got to consider Blackman threw 292 times and Hornibrook threw only 122 times. And so looking at that comparison, definitely, I mean, it's just not as accurate. But, I mean, Hornibrook last season, I mean, no doubt he was a good quarterback. I just think in the end he was not able to lead a team like Florida State. And so I think James Blackman next season, I think he was the better move for this team to go with him primarily last season. And I'm looking forward to seeing how he does in 2020. I think he's definitely a very appealing quarterback, and I definitely think he's got the upside to be a great quarterback and one of the better ones in the ACC next season. It's just a matter of whether or not he can lower his interception rate. But in the end, once again, he's still an accurate quarterback. 63% is what he had last season, pretty much as a full-time quarterback. And so in the end, I mean, that was pretty impressive, and I definitely think he's got the potential to have a great season in 2020. As far as the running back core goes, of course, you lose your top running back in Cam Akers. That is by far the toughest loss that this team is facing going into next season, as he had 1,400 yards last season with 18 touchdowns. And so that's going to be a brutal loss there. I mean, Cam Akers was a really great running back for this team, definitely one of the best in their conference in 2019. So yeah, watch out for that loss there. That's going to be a very difficult one for this Seminole team to have to lose there. But as far as the receiving core goes, they've got a great receiving core coming back for next season. They returned their top wide receiver in Tamorian Terry, and last season he ended up putting up nearly 1,200 yards with 9 touchdowns. And so yeah, expect him to put up a major season for Florida State. He's definitely going to be, I would say, a top 5, top 6 receiver in the ACC next season. You also returned your second receiver in DJ Matthews, and last season he put up just right around 400 yards with 3 touchdowns. So there's a major gap there in between Terry and Matthews. And so yeah, Terry is definitely your most important receiver going into next season. You definitely don't want him injured. If he gets injured, that'd be very detrimental to this Florida State team if that happens next season. But still, I mean, in the end, the receiving core is looking very good. They also returned several other receivers with 200 yards, and so Yeah, that's going to be good for this team. I believe they've got 4 or 5 receivers last season that had right around 200 yards. So, yeah, several receivers had action last season. They also had a couple of injuries, though, so you do have to consider that. But in the end, the biggest part of that receiving core is Tamorrion Terry, and that's going to be huge for this Florida State team to be returning him for next season. Their only wide receiver loss, though, is Keith Gavin. You can't forget about him. I mean, he didn't really put up all that big of a season. He had 208 yards, didn't even have a touchdown last season, but still, it is a receiver loss, so you do have to mention it. But as far as the offensive line goes, they lose 2 on there. They also lose one defensive lineman and 2 in the secondary. So this defense should definitely make some big strides going into next season, I would say. Of course, they only have 3 losses overall. So really, that is not terrible at all. I mean, most defenses in general, I would say on average lose 4. So for Florida State to only lose 3, I definitely think this defense should be bound for a great season in 2020. They're definitely going to improve a lot on how they were in 2019 for sure. So watch out for that defense for Florida State. But brings up the question, how much improvement will there be in 2020 for this Florida State team? I'd say this team is definitely going to have some improvement. It's just a matter of how much. I mean, when you're having your quarterback coming back, I mean, the only uncertainty for this team, in my opinion, is the running back core. Once again, losing Cam Akers, that is going to be a tough loss in general. It's just a matter of whether or not Florida State will have a running back to take over his place. But, I mean, last season, as far as the running back core goes, you did have a couple other running backs put up some decent yardage. You had Kalan Laborn. Of course, last season he put up nearly 300 yards. And then you also had Jordan Travis, who put up 228 yards. But in the end, yeah, the running back core definitely does have a couple of uncertainties there. And especially with losing Cam Akers, you can't forget about that. But in the end, I definitely think this team is going to have some improvement next season. They should have no problem making a bowl game. So yeah, watch out for that for sure. But in the end, once again, I definitely think this Florida State team with James Blackman at quarterback, especially if Blackman can improve his interception ratio and he can just become a more accurate quarterback, that is going to be very huge in determining how well this team is going to be next season. Anyway, let's look at your schedule now. You start off the season on September 5th against West Virginia, assuming that the non-conference games do not get canceled, which there's still some uncertainty there as well. But you will be playing West Virginia in a neutral location. And then you got Samford on the 12th of September, followed by a trip to Boise to play Boise State. That should be a very interesting game there on the 19th against Boise State. Of course, last season, Boise State ended up coming into Florida State and upsetting the Seminoles. And so I'm sure Florida State's going to be very motivated to win that game there in Boise. But on October, you got NC State then on the road to finish or to start off your month. Then you got a big tough game against Clemson on the 10th. And then you got Wake Forest on the 17th, followed by a road trip to Louisville on the 24th. And then you got Pittsburgh on the 31st. And then you go into your November and you got 4 more games. You've got Miami on the road, followed by Boston College at home. And then you got Syracuse on the road. And then to finish off your season, you got a really tough one against Florida. Florida next season, I definitely think should be a great team. So that's going to be probably, I would say, your toughest game of the season there against Florida. But then again, you do have to play Clemson as well. So both of those teams in general are going to be pretty tough. But in the end, this schedule is very tough. I would say this Florida State team honestly probably has one of the best or one of the toughest schedules going into the 2020 season for sure. I mean, you got to play Boise State on the road for one of your non-conference games. And then you got West Virginia as well for another non-conference game. And then you also have to play Clemson and Florida, 2 national contenders for next season as well. So, yeah, it will not be easy for Florida State for sure. I mean, if they had an easier schedule, like if they had the schedule that, say, Wake Forest had, I think Florida State could easily be a 9-10 win team next season, and I'm actually kind of serious about that. I definitely think Florida State has got the talent to do that. But in the end, this schedule is very tough for Florida State. But in the end, here's what I'm expecting at your September. I think you get 3 wins here. I think you beat off West Virginia and Samford pretty easily. However, I do think you go into Boise and you do get a win. That's going to be a huge win for this Florida State team as you move into your October. And it's going to be a close one. I do not expect it to be a blowout by any means, but I do expect Florida State to get the win there in the end. So you do go into your October with a 3-0 overall record. And then I think you're going to get a couple of big wins in your October as well. I think you beat off NC State to start off the month. I do think that you take a loss against Clemson, and I went back and forth on that. I mean, Florida State is at home for that game, so that could be a possible trap game for Clemson, but I think Clemson in the end does get the win over Florida State. They're going to stand defeated. And I do think Florida State bounces back the next week and gets a win over Wake Forest. That one will be an easier one. However, I do think you lose the next week against Louisville on the road. And Louisville next season, don't sleep on them as well. They're another team. I mean, there's several teams in the ACC, such as Virginia Tech, You could also throw in Louisville in there, of course, as well, where I think these teams definitely could be very good teams for sure going into next season. So don't be sleeping on them for sure. But yeah, Louisville next season, I expect them to be good, and I think they get the win over Florida State at home. And then I think Pittsburgh, that's going to be a tough one too, but I think Florida State does get the win in the end over the Pittsburgh Panthers. Anyway, moving into our November now. Of course, you start off the month against Miami on the road on November 7th. I think you take a loss there as well. And I went back and forth on that one too. I think Miami next season in general is a bowl team. I think Miami definitely will put up the improvement to do that. But in the end, Miami I definitely think gets the win there. It's going to be close though. I definitely think Florida State keeps it close with Miami. I just think Miami in the end gets the win. However, I do think you get two big wins against Boston College and Syracuse between November 14th and the 19th, and then you finish off the season with a loss against Florida on November 28th. So in the end, you're going to have 4 losses next season. Your record prediction will be 8-4, and your conference prediction will be 5-3. So in the end, honestly, that's a very good season, I would say, in comparison to last season in general. I think Florida State definitely does improve on their 2019 season. They'll make it to a pretty good bowl game, especially considering that I expect them to have 8 wins next season. But once again, it comes all down to how tough the schedule is for Florida State. I mean, the good thing is you do have Clemson and Florida both at home, so there's a possibility for an upset there. But in the end, I think that Clemson and Florida next season will just be too good for the Seminole team, and I think that they do get the wins over Florida State in the end. But yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd like to hear your thoughts on Florida State next season. Let me know your record predictions, your game predictions, all of that. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. But in the end, thanks again for watching. If you enjoyed this preview, be sure to slap a like on it and subscribe as well. It really helps out the channel, and I really appreciate that. But as always, thanks again for watching. Stay tuned for more from All Sports Central, and I'll see you all later.